All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Eagle Investors. Today we will be talking about barriers to entry. Now, if you don't remember what a barrier to entry is, the simplest way to think about it is it's just a fancy term for anything that's a barrier or keeps you from starting your company. So, any kind of challenge or roadblock or obstacle or barrier for you to start a company or enter a market is considered a barrier to entry. Pretty simple and self-explanatory term once you just think about it a little bit. So today we're going to be talking about a couple different things in terms of barriers to entry for competitors of a company, barriers to entry for a company. We're going to be going over a couple of different things, but first we should understand the term competitive advantage. A competitive advantage is what you do better than your competition if you are a company. So the reason this is so important is because let's say I start a shoe brand and I call it Will Shoes, and I make a shoe that's exactly like the Nike shoe, except it's a Will shoe. There's no reason for anyone to buy my shoes. They're not cheaper, they're not different, they look the same, they serve the same function. Why would anyone want to buy my shoes? I have no competitive advantage. A competitive advantage could be you make it cheaper, you make it better, it runs longer, it's a better product, people like the colors more. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But as long as you have something that you do better than your competition, you now have a competitive advantage. With that, we're going to talk about barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are anything that makes it hard to start a business in a particular industry. Now, the reason we say particular industry here is because barriers to entry can change based on your industry. A great example of this is in the healthcare space. In the healthcare space, you have to get approval from the FDA or another governmental organization before you can start making medical devices. Now, these regulation tends to be much more complicated than in other sectors, much more difficult to navigate and get approval for because you're doing stuff, that might involve surgery, and so you have to go through medical trials. That's an excellent example of a barrier to entry that's industry specific. If you're creating a new type of shoe, you do not have to go through medical trials for open heart surgery before you can put it out into the market. If you're making a new kind of pacemaker, you probably do need to. Barriers to entry are things that make it more difficult to launch a product or service. So we just talked about government regulation, but it can just be, regular costs of starting a business, building a product. It can also be stuff like licensing, which is usually done on a state-by-state basis. Now, barriers to entry can also be a beneficial thing. I know this sounds a little bit weird, but if you are already a company in a space, you now like barriers to entry because barriers to entry means that it is harder for competitors to enter your market and start competing with you. So once you're in that market, it's going to be very difficult for someone else to get in and take your business. Entrepreneurs should identify barriers to entry in their business plan. This is really kind of an obvious one. You always want to make sure you identify your barriers to entry because they are, very important when you're looking at creating a business. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple of different types of barriers to entry. The first one we're going to talk about is IP or intellectual property. I'm going to make this a little bit simpler than it might be on the document. Intellectual property just means anything that you do that's your own anything you do that can be certified by the government as intellectual property. We're going to be talking about a couple of different types. What you need to know about intellectual property means it is protected by law. So anything where you see, people can't open up a restaurant under the McDonald's logo. Why? Because the McDonald's logo and the McDonald's brand name are protected by law. They're a type of intellectual property. So I can't just open up a business and call it a McDonald's because it's not. It's not my company. I can't just say it is. That's a type of IP. First one we're going to talk about is patents. You've probably heard of patents if you've ever, seen Shark Tank. They always ask, do you have a patent on this? Do you have a patent on that? A patent means you invented something, and the government protects the person who invented it for a certain period of years so that no one else can make it. Now, if this sounds a little bit complicated, all it means is, let's say you invent a new type of, screwdriver. The government says, Fred, for the next 14 years, no one else can make that type of screwdriver because you invented it. The reason this is important is because it lets small inventors make their own inventions and products without large companies just being able to step in and make a knockoff the second they did. Think about it. If there was no patent, the second anyone made, an innovation in the shoe space, it didn't matter how much better it was. Nike would just step in, they would do the same thing, and no one could ever start a new company. It's part of the reason patents are important. So when you're looking at a patent, here are a couple of different things you want to, key terms you want to know. Prior art search. What this means is you have to check that no one else did the thing that you're doing. So it's not considered unique enough to get a patent. If, someone else already invented the same thing, you can't say it's yours. Issued patent. So if someone else has a patent on it, you can't patent it as well. Issued patent also means that it has been protected by the U.S. Patent Office. Provisional patent. Now, you will see this a lot. A provisional patent means that the patent office is looking into giving you an issued patent, and it allows you to say what's called patent pending. But it doesn't mean you actually have an issued patent. What this means is you're still in the process, and it doesn't actually protect you from having other people knock your thing off. So until you have what's called an issued patent, your IP is not protected. This is very important. You'll hear investors ask a lot, do you have a provisional patent or do you have an issued patent? That distinction is really key, and that's the most important thing to take away from patents here. International or PCT application. I'm not going to go into details on this. Basically, it means that you can get patents in a bunch of different countries at the same time. Patent duration. Patents do expire after a while. Utility patents, you can see, last 20 years. A design patent lasts for 14 years. All this means is after a certain number of years, it is no longer protected by law and other people can copy it. So let's go back to the screwdriver that was protected for 14 years. 14 years later, someone else can come along and they can make the same thing because it's no longer protected, so that there can be competition in the market. That's just the way it's set up legally. And then patent troll. You'll hear about patent trolls. Patent troll, it's a pejorative for someone that tries, basically they buy patents from people, and then they try to apply them as broadly as possible and extort money out of small businesses. So what this means is, let's say you're trying to take your company public, right? Which means you're going to IPO on the stock market. If you don't remember that term, you can go back and look at previous lectures. But basically, you're going to put shares of your company on the public market. Everyone's going to make a ton of money because you have a great invention and the company's been doing really well. And then some lawyer comes along, and this lawyer has a patent that doesn't really apply to your invention. I mean, it's kind of similar, but it's not actually what you invented. But this lawyer wants to take you to court over this patent because he says that you're violating his IP. Now, this is bad because it means you can't actually IPO until you get this sorted out, right? If it's not yours, you can't start selling stuff. It creates a bunch of legal issues. And what a patent troll does is they take these patents and basically they start making these false claims about what their patent covers. And then they say, but if you pay me X amount of money, it all goes away. So what they do is they go to these companies right before an important deadline, often, and they say, you need to pay me this amount of money or I'm taking you to court and it's going to drag out for, 6 months, 8 months, however long it takes. You're not going to be able to get your money. It's going to screw up your business, and you just need to pay me now to make me go away. It's a very slimy thing, but it happens. Next is trade secrets. Trade secrets are something that makes a product special, but it's not protected by law. So what this means is, the recipe for Coca-Cola, amazing example of this. The recipe for Coca-Cola is not legally protected. Now, the reason it is not legally protected, if you go right back up and you look at patents, what do we talk about? A patent expires after a certain amount of time. So, if Coca-Cola tried to patent their recipe, no one could copy it for 20 years. But 20 years from now, every supermarket cola could just go ahead and copy their recipe, and it would no longer be unique. Trade secret means that they just don't tell anyone how it's made, and no one else can figure out exactly how to copy it. That's why all the supermarket colas never really taste quite the same as Coke. Another great example of this is KFC. Basically, they just keep it a really, really big secret, and no one can figure out how to do it. Copyrights. So copyrights are protection for intellectual and artistic work like literature, magazines, newspapers, music, and art. So if you've ever seen a little C next to something, that means that it's copyrighted. Actually, technically, this Eagle Investors material is copyrighted because we made it ourselves. All this means is you can't take someone else's book, print it, and sell it if it belongs to them. So basically, it protects music, anything like that. It's kind of like a patent, but it protects artistic works. Trademarks. So if you remember when I talked about McDonald's earlier, where you can't just open up a restaurant and call it a McDonald's because it's not your company and you're not allowed to do that, it's protected on what's called a trademark. So if you see a TM, that's called an unregistered trademark, and if you see a registered trademark, it's going to have that little R next to it. These are just the official symbols. So if you ever wonder what those little letters are next to names, that's what these things are going to be. So this means you can't like call it a Nike shoe if it's not made by Nike. You can't call it, a McDonald's store if it's not made by McDonald's. Suppliers. So suppliers can be a barrier to entry, especially if they have what's called exclusive rights. Basically, if you can't find anyone to make stuff for you, or if you can't get the materials to make it, then that can be a barrier to entry. Same thing with manufacturing. If you can't get anyone to make your product, that's a barrier to entry. Cost. This one's really, really common. This is why a lot of companies end up with like VC funding, is because it can be very, very expensive to get a business running because you have to make stuff and pay people. And so cost is definitely a barrier to entry in almost every market there is. Brand or reputation. This one's interesting. It varies by industry, but basically, if people already know other people in the industry and they have a very strong brand identification, it's going to be very hard to get into that industry. Nike's a great example of this. People very strongly identify with the Nike brand. And if there was a replacement for Nike shoes, it would be very hard to get people to buy them because they don't have the Nike label, because people have such a strong brand identification. First mover advantage. First mover advantage is, it might sound like a complicated term, but it's not. Basically, it means if you're the first person to figure out how to do something, you automatically get an advantage because now you have no competitors. This should make a lot of sense. Like, let's say I invent a new type of electric car, right? Amazing new type of electric car. I'm the first one to figure it out. I make a company. I now have first mover advantage because no one else knows how to do it, and I have no competition. That's why this is so good. If you go back and look at our competition section, that should help you understand a little bit more. Research and development. So you'll hear this called R&D all the time. Research and development. It's a barrier to entry because it's very expensive to do, and oftentimes you have to keep doing research and development to keep your products up to date. So R&D, it's very similar to cost because it can be very expensive to do, but basically you have to constantly be spending money to innovate your products if you want to stay competitive in a market or enter a market. Last is government regulation. It varies by industry how big of a deal this one is. If you're making like a web application, the laws are not particularly tight, relatively speaking. If you're making something like a medical device that goes in someone's chest, like a pacemaker, the laws are incredibly stringent on what standards you have to meet. But almost every type of business there's some kind of federal, state, or local regulation that applies no matter what it is. You just have to figure out whether you need like a license to open a barber shop or you need to go through, medical trials to make your pacemaker. It just depends on the industry. So these are all of the barriers to entry. If you have any questions about them, you can just ask me during the next meeting, and we'll go over it then. Thank you all. Bye.